All right, let's dive right into this explainer and explore a seriously fascinating piece of institutional history. We're going to unpack how an entire nation managed to transition from an armed civil war to an incredibly tight, highly bureaucratic system of class harmony. And, perhaps more importantly, we're going to look at why that very system, which honestly used to be the envy of Europe for its stability, is now under severe threat. We are talking about the Austrian model, a totally unique form of political and economic organization that has essentially shaped the country for decades.
To make sense of this whole journey, we're going to hit 5 key areas today. First, the roots of this class harmony. Second, breaking down how the Austrian model actually works. Third, the cracks forming in the system. Fourth, the shifting political power. And finally, 3 scenarios for the future.
So let's kick things off with part 1, the roots of class harmony.
We really have to wind the clock back to the 1930s here. You literally cannot grasp this modern system of consensus without first understanding the extreme, violent class struggle that birthed it. We're not just talking about heated debates in parliament. We are talking about blood in the streets. If we look at the timeline from the source material, it's incredibly tense. In 1927, you have the bloody suppression of a working-class revolt. Fast forward to March 1933, and Chancellor Dollfuss effectively shuts down the parliament, which paved the way for an authoritarian regime. And then, in February 1934, the whole thing boils over into an open arms struggle, a literal short civil war between revolutionary workers and the Austro-fascist regime. This created a deeply, deeply traumatic historical baseline. For the folks who survived this era and World War II, finding a way to stabilize society wasn't just a nice-to-have, it was an absolute do-or-die necessity to stop the country from tearing itself apart all over again.
But, and this is a crucial point, the historical record shows that not everyone looked back on this push for peace as a total victory. According to a retrospective by the Party of Labor of Austria, this whole post-war shift toward institutional cooperation is viewed through a highly critical lens. From their perspective, the leadership of the Social Democratic Party, the SPO, didn't just compromise, they effectively abandoned the class struggle. In this view, what was branded as a social partnership-based class harmony was really just a subjugation of the working class, a sellout of their revolutionary goals in exchange for a comfortable seat at the capitalist table. It's a stark reminder that consensus always comes with a hefty price tag of compromise.
Moving right along to part 2, the Austrian model explained.
So what was the actual institutional fix designed to keep that 1930s violence locked in the past? It's a system built on the very idea that capital and labor absolutely must, legally and formally, work together. We're talking about a concept called Austrocorporatism, or Austrocorporatismus. Now, as the Wikipedia source points out, we need to be clear here. This is not your run-of-the-mill lobbying. In most countries, interest groups are on the outside fighting for lawmakers' attention. In Austria, a specific set of massive partner organizations are legally hardwired into the state's lawmaking machinery. They hold a strict, literal monopoly on political representation. They are brought in to consult on and honestly often draft the laws before they even see the inside of parliament.
And there are 4 unshakable pillars holding this whole thing up. You've got the WKO, representing business and commerce, the LKO for agriculture, the BAK, or Chamber of Labor, representing employees, and the OGB, which is the massive trade union federation. Thanks to that legal representation monopoly we just talked about, these 4 entities are the exclusive, legally recognized voices for capital, agriculture, and labor in Austria. Basically, if you work in Austria, you are almost certainly represented by one of these giants, very often through compulsory membership.
Now, imagine the sheer balancing act these groups have to pull off every single day. The academic sources highlight that they're basically caught in a tug-of-war between 2 competing forces. On one side, you have the influence logic. To keep their VIP seat at the government's table, they've got to play nice, be reliable, moderate, expert partners who help the state function smoothly. But on the flip side, the base logic. They still have millions of grassroots members who expect them to fight tooth and nail for their specific, sometimes radical needs. Trying to keep the state running smoothly while simultaneously keeping demanding members happy, it is an incredibly delicate high-wire act.
Which brings us perfectly into part 3, cracks in the system.
Because, well, that high-wire act is starting to wobble pretty significantly. If we dig into the data from the Demokratiezentrum Wien, we see this carefully balanced post-war machinery facing a massive modern crisis. Just look at this hollowing out of the union base. In just a single decade, from 1987 to 1997, total OGB membership fell by nearly 10%. But the sector breakdown is where it gets really stark. Chemical workers dropped by almost a third, and textile and leather workers plummeted by over 53%. And to be clear, this isn't because folks suddenly decided they didn't like unions. It's driven entirely by structural economic shifts. We're talking deindustrialization. The traditional industrial jobs that formed the absolute bedrock of the union's power are simply shrinking.
And as if losing members wasn't enough, they got hit with massive external pressures too. It's your classic globalization story. The real shock to the system here was Austria joining the European Union back in 1995. Literally overnight, these Austrian social partners lost their exclusive grip on major national economic policies. Suddenly, huge decisions regarding currency, agriculture, and macroeconomics were being made in Brussels, not Vienna. So these historically inward-looking national chambers were suddenly forced to adapt to this huge European stage, where their unique little national monopolies just didn't carry the same weight. All right, let's pivot to part 4, shifting political power.
Because the ground isn't just shifting economically. The very politicians they work with are changing the rules of the game. The source material draws a super sharp contrast here. In the traditional era, these social partners essentially drafted the laws in a back room before Parliament even got a glance at them. Their legislative power was immense. But cut to the modern era, specifically looking at coalitions like the conservative OVP and right-wing FPO, and you see governments actively sidestepping this entire consensus model. They prefer to introduce laws directly into Parliament, totally bypassing the label chambers. And even more aggressively, politicians from these coalitions have actually proposed massive funding cuts, like going after the mandatory funding that Chamber of Labor depends on. That is a direct existential threat to the survival of these partners.
So where does this all go? That's part 5. 3 scenarios for the future.
What actually happens next to this deeply entrenched, highly unique system? Well, the researchers at the Demokratiezentrum Wien have mapped out exactly where this might lead, outlining 3 potential paths. Step 1 is the negative dynamic. This is where the traditional model just totally collapses into extreme partisanship and dysfunction, entirely losing its legitimacy as politicians strip its power. Step 2 is the positive dynamic, a resurgence. The partners adopt brilliantly and carve out a powerful new role in EU macropolitics. But then there's step 3, the mixed dynamic, which the researchers view as highly likely. The system survives, sure, but it limps along. It operates with a restricted scope, way less political influence, and instead of quiet backroom consensus, it's defined by constant internal friction and frequent public conflict.
And that leaves us with a huge, lingering question to consider as we wrap up this explainer. Will a model that was literally forged as a direct antidote to the bloody violence of the 1930s, a system tailor-made for an industrial, sovereign post-war nation, ultimately buckle under the crushing weight of modern global economics, European integration, and highly polarized 21st century politics? It's a profound test, really, of whether our institutions can ever truly outlive the eras that birthed them.